Hey, it's Random Code here, and today I want to showcase how you can use Spring Boot to connect to a database and then retrieve data. And in this case, I'm using Spring Boot JPA for my data retrieval, and I'm then using a MySQL database from a Docker container, which I will be showcasing and creating first. We'll then connect to our database, and we'll then extract some data and have an endpoint of a REST API where we can then go all the way from retrieving data from database, manipulating the data if needed, and then sending it to this API. So first, let me just showcase a simple Docker setup. I have a SQL file, which will then be called inside onto my database. So I will create a new database called user app. I will then use this user app. I will then create a table called users, just containing a basic ID, name, and email with the primary key of user ID. I will then just insert some dummy data. So we just have a few people. So we have David, Jens, and Leah, and just a random email. To then create this database into my Docker container, I'm using Docker Compose, where I create this single service called my DB based on an MySQL image. It's going to be restarting if it fails. I set an environment variable, which is going to be my SQL root password. I'm just setting the password to password, very simple. I'm then exposing some ports, so I'm exposing my SQL port from inside the container, 3306, which is the main port MySQL is using to expose information. And I'm then going to be exposing it to port 3306 from outside my container, which allows me then from Spring to connect to this port to retrieve my data. And I'm then moving using volumes my data SQL file into Docker entry point initialize db.d, which is a folder inside this container, which would be run when the database is started, and therefore would allow us to set up some databases, tables with some data. To then actually connect to this database from Spring, we are using actually a very, very simple setup, because Spring simply allows us to go into our resource folder. We then have this application properties file, where we simply just set a few properties. We set that we are using Spring JPA Hibernate, also update. We set our data source with an URL, where we simply define that it's JDBC, or database. It's going to be MySQL. And then it's going to be localhost, port 3306. And we would like to use its database called user app. I will then define for our data source a password and a username. And we didn't set any username, so the username is just going to be root. And as we defined in our Docker Compose, our password is just going to be password. And now we have our Docker setup, the running Docker container containing our MySQL. We have a table inside a new database with some data. We then connect to our database using Spring Boot. We would then create some persistence entities, which would then map this table to be a Java entity or a Java object. So I will create an user entity defined with entity tag from Spring Boot. I will define that it is from the table users from the database user app. I would then match more or less the same setup as we had in our database. So we have a user ID, we have a name, and we have an email. And I'm just overriding it simple to string, because I'm later just going to be showcasing it as clear string, which is just a very simple way of doing it. But the main thing to note, we have this add ID, matching our ID from our database, we have the name and the email as in our SQL. We then also have a user repository, which allow us to actually create Spring queries, more or less. So instead of doing plain SQL queries, we can do it like this. So we add a repository tag, and this is going to be an interface, which is going to be extending our JPA repository. We're then defining that when extracting information with this repository, it's going to be extracting based on a user entity. And then our user entity is based off our users table. So it's kind of going all the way through each entity like this. And we're defining that the ID in our user entity is going to be an integer. We can then create very simple queries to our database. For example, find by name, and then we give it a variable of string name. So note here, we're not doing SQL queries, but our queries are actually the naming of our methods. So let me just showcase. if we wanted another query to our database where we would retrieve a user entity and we would like to find by name and email, for example, I would simply do it like this, find by name and email. We would then need to give it 2 parameters in the same order as mentioned in the name of our method. So find by name. So first we would need to be name. And actually it doesn't matter what it's called, but it just knows that the first parameter in this method is going to be similar to the name, and the second going to be the email. So just to make it a bit clearer, do string name, comma, string email. And that's actually it. So no SQL, no queries, we can just do it by names. And this is good in the way that it's actually very simple and quick and easy, but these method names become quite long if we're doing more complicated queries. So, and then to actually retrieve our data and use it somewhere, I'm just created a simple controller with a REST controller. So we're going to be exposing an API. So we have our user repository. It's going to be constructor injected into our controller using autowired. So we have our interface, autowired, give me an implementation of this user repository and define it here. I would then very simply have a get mapping to create a simple API where it's all going to be running on localhost 8080/users. And we would then have a request parameter for this name of our user. We would then simply take this name, pass it to the user repository, find by name parameter. We then have our user, and I'm then in this case just going to be returning to my API a string containing all my user information. So let's actually go through how we set all of this up. We now have a basic understanding of how it works. To then actually get it working, we need to do a few things. First, we need to run our Docker Compose file. So I would go into a terminal. I would go into my Docker folder. And in here we have our data.sql and our Docker Compose file. I would then do Docker Compose up to start my Docker Compose file. It's then going to take a few seconds to load it. So we now waited a few seconds and we can now see that in our terminal that our database is saying ready for connection on port 3306. And because we exposed our port, let me just showcase, we could do docker container ls. Now we have this running Docker container, which is exposing a port on localhost port 3306. I would then very simply just start my Spring Boot application. And it's going to take a few seconds. And we see now it started DB setup application in about 3 seconds. We would now be able to go into Postman, which is just a very simple tool that allows me to call some basic APIs. So I just call on localhost 8080, because that is the standard of what Spring will be starting. And we can see it here as well, that Tomcat initialized with ports 8080. That can also be changed, but that's just a standard. And inside our REST controller, we define that it's going to be on /users. Because we would like to search on the name in this case, it's going to be, let's actually just have a look at our data. So for example, we would like to retrieve David. So I would do name and David. And we can see here our API is called /users name equals David. And when we now call this API, we can see that we're retrieving as a string. Note, this is not JSON. Just need to do a bit extra setup to actually retrieve it as JSON. But in this case, it's just returning a simple string containing our user entity with ID 1, name David, and email david@email.com. And we can do the same with Leah, for example, and so on. So it works. And of course, this is a lot of files and a lot to take in. I would put this entire project onto GitHub, where you should be able to have a look at it yourself. And you can take a look at whatever you want. And I highly recommend, if you're doing something like this, maybe even pull the repository from GitHub and actually try running it yourself. So if you enjoyed this showcase of how we can use Spring Boot and Docker to set up a SQL server and then create a REST API connecting to this SQL server, please leave a like and subscribe, and I wish you all a wonderful day.